No one would be surprised to hear me say that J.R.R. Tolkien was a really big fan of fantasy. You might even call that a bit of an understatement. But that doesn't mean that Tolkien never strayed outside of his preferred genre. In the 1930s, Tolkien sat down with his longtime friend C.S. Lewis, and they agreed that there simply were not enough stories out there that were written to their taste, and they would have to remedy that. They agreed to take a step into the science fiction genre together, and Lewis was assigned the subject of space travel, while Tolkien took on time travel. C.S. Lewis wrote the Space Trilogy, and Tolkien began writing a piece that he called The Lost Road. The Lost Road was never finished, but I find the existing excerpts of this story to be fascinating. Tolkien had a very unique approach to the concept of time travel that involved treating languages, and especially names, as one of the primary things that connected humans to the past. And although The Lost Road was eventually abandoned, the mythic groundwork that Tolkien laid in these drafts would be hugely influential to the tales that he would come to tell in The Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings. I think that you could probably debate back and forth on whether or not the story laid out in The Lost Road is technically science fiction, but it was definitely Tolkien's best attempt at science fiction, and I think that it allowed for a sudden burst of creativity and connection that would be absolutely instrumental in shaping his fantasy. So go ahead and buckle up and get yourself ready for a lot of weird sounding, slightly confusing names, most of which start with A. But you know what won't be confusing? Learning coding with this video's sponsor, boot.dev. Confession time! I am not good at learning new things. I get freaked out when I feel like I'm in over my head, so suffice it to say, something as complicated as coding has always felt incomprehensible to me. But with this video's sponsor, boot.dev, I've been reminded of the fact that learning can actually be fun. Boot.dev uses a hands-on RPG-like experience to help you learn everything that you need to know about software development. You can learn back-end web development from start to finish in Python, SQL, and Go, and you get to learn by doing what you'd actually be doing at a job, by building real projects. Boot.dev makes learning coding feel just like a game, and it is so simple that even someone as tech illiterate as I am can follow it. Not to mention that they have a Discord community with tons of real humans to help you if you get stuck on something. Plus, their Training Grounds feature can provide personalized challenges to help you work on the concepts that you might be struggling with. All of their content is completely free to read and watch, but a paid membership unlocks features like hands-on coding, progress tracking, and game mechanics. So what are you waiting for? They even have a 30-day no questions asked refund policy and a free demo of the interactive experience on every course. You can check them out at the link in my description, or go to boot.dev and use my code JessOfTheShire to get 25% off your entire first year on the annual plan. Thank you so much to boot.dev for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Tolkien's drafts of The Lost Road can be found in the 5th History of Middle-earth volume, aptly titled The Lost Road and Other Writings. It is somewhat fragmented, but Christopher Tolkien provides a lot of helpful context in that book if you're interested in checking that out. The bulk of the material was written sometime before 1937, which would position it just after the success of The Hobbit, and just as Tolkien was starting to put together the ideas that would become The Lord of the Rings. And we only have 2 existing chapters to kick off this story. The story takes place in the present day, well, Tolkien's present day, so roughly the 1930s, on the western coast of England, and we see a man named Oswin Errol searching for his son, Alwin. He finds the 12-year-old boy sitting on a low wall, gazing out at the Atlantic Ocean. The father and son have a chat about Alwin's rather unique name. "Why am I called Alwin? They often ask me why Alwin at school, and they call me All Bone. But I'm not, am I? You look rather bony, boy, but you are not all bone, I am glad to say. I am afraid I called you Alwin, and that is why you are called it. I am sorry. I never meant it to be a nuisance to you." "But it is a real name, isn't it?" said Alboin eagerly. "I mean, it means something, and men have been called it? It isn't just invented?" "Of course not. It is just as real and just as good as Oswin, and it belongs to the same family, you might say." Oswin soothes Alboin's concerns by telling him the story of the 6th century Lombard king named Albuin, and all of his bloody exploits and adventures. But that isn't the only man who's borne the name. Albuin is actually the etymological equivalent to the Anglo-Saxon name Alfwine, which means elf friend. Oswin explains the storied history of the name and its legacy through time, from the grandson of King Alfred in the 10th century to the warrior at the Battle of Maldon. They discuss Albuin's now-deceased mother, who thought that the boy would be a girl and thus had no input in his name. Oswin chose the name over the Anglo-Saxonized form Alfwine, or the Latinized Albinus, because it is the uniquely English form of the name, imbued with a kind of inherent Englishness that Oswin notes is becoming quite rare those days. When Albuin goes to bed that night, he gazes out his window. Tolkien writes, "It was a late sunset, for it was summer. The sun sank slowly into the sea and dipped red beyond the horizon. The light and color faded quickly from the water. A chilly wind came up out of the west, and over the sunset rim, great dark clouds sailed up, stretching huge wings southward and northward, threatening the land. They look like the eagles of the Lord of the West coming upon Numenor," Albuin said aloud, and he wondered why, though it did not seem very strange to him. In those days he often made up names. Looking upon a familiar hill, he would see it suddenly standing in some other time and story. "The green shoulders of Amon Ereb," he would say. Some of these names were really made up to please himself with their sound, or so he thought, but others seemed real, as if they had not been spoken first by him. One of these imaginative figments is the land of Numenor, which he observes could be the subject of a long story. Albuin goes on to learn all the classics in school, Latin and Greek, but he finds himself most drawn to the languages of the North, like Old English and Welsh. He finds that for these languages, one ends up learning their history through the grammar and vocabulary itself, through its gradual changes, its cultural crossovers, a record of tradition and time communicated through the minutiae of language. Albuin frequently discusses these things, as well as his invented languages, with his father, who does his very best to understand. During one of these talks, when Albuin is 18 years old, he explains to his father the way that he sees languages as having a kind of inherent atmosphere to them, tied inherently to the places that they came from. Albuin can feel the echoes of the past bubbling up through every language. Oswin protests, "Of course, I am not a philologist, but I never could see there was much evidence in favor of ascribing language changes to substratum, though I suppose underlying ingredients do have an influence, though it is not easy to define on the final mixture in the case of peoples taken as a whole, different national talents and temperaments, and that sort of thing. But races and cultures are different from languages." The concept of substratum in philology generally means the idea that there is a stratum, or substratum, of existing language in a place, kind of like a layer of leaves on a forest floor. Even if you were to come in and lay an entirely new layer atop that substratum, even if a new dominant culture were to come in and assert their language over that of the land's natives, that substratum remains, and it may or may not have an influence on this new linguistic layer. Oswin is under the impression that this substratum is not all too important when it comes to shaping a new language. Things like a people's race or culture do cling indelibly to their human character, but language to him is simply a tool, one that could very well change over time. Albuin, however, protests. Language goes back by a continuous tradition into the past, just as much as race and culture. I often think that if you knew the living faces of any man's ancestors a long way back, you might find some queer things. You might find that he got his nose quite clearly from, say, his mother's great-grandfather. And yet that something about his nose, its expression or its set or whatever you like to call it, really came down from much further back, from, say, his great-great-great-grandfather or greater. Anyway, I like to go back, and not with race only, or culture only, or language, but with all three. Alwin is firmly of the opinion that language is an ingrained part of a human person. The substratum shapes that new layer in innumerable ways, the same way that our grandparents or our great-grandparents' genetics have influenced our own. Alwin expresses a desire to go back, to see the pieces that made him and his father who they are today. Oswin says that he can't really go back beyond research and study and imagination, and suggests that Alwin might pursue archaeology on top of his philology. Alwin says, "Good idea, but you remember long ago you said I was not all bone? Well, I want some mythology as well. I want myths, not only bones and stones." Alwin has come to the conclusion that history is not just made up of the hard record, bones and stones and ruins, but also of language and stories. Just as the northern tongues seem to hide history in their linguistic quirks, so myths can bear an imprint of all that came before them. In his free time, Alwin has been making up fake languages, mostly northern in tone, and many of them seem to come to him in dreams. He wakes up with the sound of strange words in his head, words that he can piece together using his knowledge of other tongues. However, Alwin knows that he cannot lose himself in these fancies forever. Secret dream languages don't pay the bills, and his father is growing old. In one of his final conversations with Oswin, the man asks Alwin to share one of his dream passages. Alwin recites, "Vestra lage vegas retas, nu isti sarethas." He quoted that because it had stuck in his mind, though he did not understand it. Of course, the mere sense was fairly plain. A straight road lay westward, now it is bent. He remembered waking up and feeling it was somehow very significant. He tells his father of another snippet that came to him, an Old English verse of the tale of Ælfwine, traveling west to see strange things in the homeland of the elves. This story pleases Oswin, but he dies of old age that winter. Alwin establishes himself as a professor, he marries, he has a son, and he loses his wife in childbirth. His son is named Audwin, after the father of the old Lombard king, Albuin. Albuin could have named the boy the Anglo-Saxonized version of the name Edwina, or the common name Edwin, but he followed in his father's footsteps, sticking with the very English version of the name. The definition of Audwin is a bit less clear-cut, but it generally means friend of fortune or luck. Tolkien translates it as bliss friend. Audwin grows up to have many of the same interests as his father. Albuin's dreams come and go through the years, but as his son reaches the age of 16, they're becoming ever more clear and explicit. These dreams never contain images, and Albuin is never given enough to piece the story together entirely, but some of the languages were becoming complete in his understanding. Still, the primary thing that these dreams bestowed upon him was a sense of longing. We might even call it nostalgia. Tolkien writes, "Surveying the last 30 years, Alwin felt he could say that his most permanent mood, though often overlaid or suppressed, had been since childhood the desire to go back, to walk in time, perhaps, as men walk on long roads, or to survey it as men may see the world from a mountain, or the earth as a living map beneath an airship. But in any case, to see with eyes and to hear with ears, to see the lie of the old and even forgotten lands, to behold ancient men walking and hear their languages as they spoke them in the days before days, when tongues of forgotten lineage were heard in kingdoms long fallen by the shores of the Atlantic. Now a grown man, gazing out the window at the clouds and the sea, Alwin finds himself reciting that passage that had once come to him the years before, saying that the clouds look like the eagles of the Lord of the West coming upon Numenor. The lines between dream and memory blur, these visions seeming to be more like a deeply buried recollection than a subconscious invention. And Alwin thinks to himself, "I wish there was a time machine," he said aloud. But time is not to be conquered by machines. That night, Alwin dreams of a tall man named Elendil, a name which, just like his, means elf friend. Elendil offers to fulfill Alwin's desire, explaining that travel through time is not against the laws of nature, but only against the rules of nature. And if you get the right people involved, rules can be worked around. Elendil lays down the conditions for this journey. First of all, the stops along the road have already been decided. Secondly, Alwin can only return to his own time when it has been ordained. And finally, he must not leave without a companion, specifically his son. Elendil mysteriously explains that while Alwin is the ears, his son is the eyes. Alwin is deeply troubled upon waking and takes his temper out on his son. Odwin asks if his father would join him on a walk by the western sea, but lost in thought, Alwin rejects the offer. Odwin leaves, and Alwin muses on the perils that would lie ahead of him if he were to take Elendil's offer. Not just the peril of the old days, but the peril of time, of having to live his own lifetime multiple times, of being given the chance to fail his son over and over again. He falls asleep, and in his dream he agrees to go back with Odwin, who he knows would be more than willing. Then Alwin seemed to fall into a dark and a silence deep and absolute. It was as if he had left the world completely, where all silence is on the edge of sound and filled with echoes, and where all rest is but repose upon some greater motion. He had left the world and gone out. Odwin, meanwhile, wanders the shore, wishing that his father had joined him. He had planned to tell Alwin about the strange dreams that he's been experiencing, in which he sees flashes of distant worlds, silent, inexplicable images of a place and time long gone. He wishes futilely that he could hear the name or languages of these places to help him make sense of it, just as his father had so often wished that he could see the places that he was hearing. In light of this, Elendil's explanation that Alwin was the ears and Odwin was the eyes, it makes a lot more sense now. Odwin returns to the house to find his father asleep in his chair, but when he opens a door, he finds himself stepping into darkness. Stepping, perhaps, back into time. It is here that Tolkien's draft of The Lost Road ends, but he would go on to explain through notes what material was to come. The father and son duo would travel back through leaps of time, always incarnating as father and son pairs, always with names that mean elf friend and bliss friend. These adventures would include becoming Alwin and Odwin, the Lombard kings. They would do something involving a Norse ship burial, and possibly the character from legend Scyld Scefing. He planned a story that involved the Tua de Danann, or Tir na Nog of Irish myth. Tolkien mentioned a tale that would take place in the Ice Age, in which there were old kings buried in the glaciers, and an Anglo-Saxon story of someone managing to find the straight road, just like Alwin had told his father about from his dreams. Bits of Middle-earth creep into this story as well as we move further back through history, as he planned to tell the tale of Alfwine, a sailor who stumbles into the enchanted land of Tol Eressëa. Alfwine was originally planned to be the narrator of the Book of Lost Tales, an Anglo-Saxon man from our world retelling the tales of Elvendom. The Lost Road, if completed, would have been a blending of real-world history and myth with Tolkien's own invented Silmarillion mythology. Christopher Tolkien explains, My father was envisaging a massive and explicit linking of his own legends with those of many other places and times, all concerned with the stories and the dreams of people who dwelt by the Great Western Sea. But it seemed that these between bits, the actual steps back into the past, although outlined, proved to be a bit of a stumbling block for Tolkien. He never got around to writing any more than fragments of these stories. However, it was the final stop along the road that captured the bulk of his attention, the one presaged most strongly by the dreams of Alwin and Oswin, the tale of Elendil and his son, and the fall of Numenor. The tale goes that the island kingdom is gifted to a special group of humans that had assisted the gods in their fight against the evil one, Morgoth. On Numenor, humans flourish, reaching unheard-of peaks of civilization. They become the masters of water and of the land. But always, their gazes drift west, to the land that they were forbidden to go, the land of the gods. They come to desire to be immortal just as the gods are. An evil sorcerer named Thu flies to Numenor in the shape of a bird, prophesying the coming influence of Morgoth and preying on the human fear of death. Thu insists that it's the Numenorian birthright to sail west and set foot on the forbidden continent, and the king of Numenor is swayed. He sails for the shores of the holy place. The right hand of God, Manwë, discovers this, and must go to God to figure out how their disobedience shall be punished. Sorrow and dismay were in the heart of Manwë, and he spoke to Ilúvatar and took power and counsel from the Lord of all. And the fate and fashion of the world was changed. For the silence of the gods was broken suddenly, and Valinor was sundered from the earth, and a rift appeared in the midst of Belegar, east of Tol Eressëa, and into this chasm the great seas plunged, and the noise of the falling waters filled all the earth, and the smoke of the cataracts rose up above the tops of the everlasting mountains. Numenor is pulled into this rift, and it vanishes forever. Only a few remaining faithful people escape the destruction of Numenor, and they settle in the east. But their eyes will forever turn toward the western sea in longing. The way to the holy place, once a straight road, is now bent, and it is impossible for men to navigate. They have, in a way, forever lost their chance at divinity. Within these outlines of Numenor's overall plight, Tolkien wrote 2 more chapters taking place in Numenor, what likely would have made up the final section of The Lost Road. In this draft, we see Elendil, the elf friend, confronting his son Herendil, whose name means bliss friend. In a scene directly echoing that initial conversation between Alwin and his father at the beginning of The Lost Road, Elendil finds Herendil staring out at the sea, and Herendil complains about being made fun of for his name, and he is told of their lineage as comfort. Elendil and Herendil discuss the rising power of the Dark One and the temptation towards evil. Herendil is clearly more sympathetic to the cause of the Dark Sorcerer, wondering if it is not indeed their birthright to sail to the holy place and to claim their immortality, but Elendil tries to pull him back down to earth. This conflict is central to this story. Christopher Tolkien writes of this draft, "The notes make it very clear that my father was concerned, above all, with the relation between father and son, which was cardinal. In Numenor, he had engendered a situation in which there was the potentiality of anguishing conflict between them, totally incommensurate with the quiet harmony in which the Earls began or ended. The relationship of Elendil and Herendil was subject to profound menace." Tolkien's overall plan for this story seemed to be to take these father and son duos and put them into important moments in history, to challenge them with these complex scenarios. It would be a sort of test, cyclical through time, one that examined just how much things change through time and space, but also how they stay just the same. His plan was to have, in each of these time periods, one of the characters, or both of the characters, plagued with dreams, and one of them would make the observation that the clouds look like the eagles of the west coming upon Numenor. And in the end, with Numenor's destruction, these centuries of visions would be fulfilled. Sort of fulfilled in reverse. It's kind of a reverse prophecy, a memory. Time travel is really confusing. The context of The Lost Road was the very first time that Tolkien wrote about Numenor. And if you know anything about the Silmarillion, you'll know that Numenor becomes quite important. The tale of the downfall of Numenor acts as the bridge between the events of the First Age, which was some of the very first mythic material that Tolkien ever wrote, and the events of the Third Age, The Lord of the Rings, which came much later. Numenor is a very important pivot point when it comes to tone. Humans, rather than elves, through the story of Numenor, become the central dramatic characters. Thu would be renamed Sauron, and he would become the primary villain. Rather than dragons and balrogs and god-like elves, the story tackles a much more grounded form of evil, a much more real form of evil. If you'll remember, The Lost Road took shape just as Tolkien was laying the groundwork for The Lord of the Rings, and Numenor's story was the missing link between Tolkien's great mythology and the tale of the ring. The legend of Numenor would honestly change very little from these first drafts. Even Elendil makes it in there as one of the few surviving faithful. Characters like Elendil and his son Isildur, as he would come to be called, would directly lay the groundwork for the tale of the Lord of the Rings, establishing the human kingdom of Gondor, playing a role in all the ring drama, and being ancestors to Aragorn. Tolkien abandoned The Lost Road, but The Lost Road had already stamped a permanent imprint onto what would become Tolkien's greatest work. And that is really interesting, because the story of Numenor is basically just Tolkien's fanfiction of the Atlantis tale. We have the great city swept under the waves by the gods because of human hubris. But this isn't a critique. I find this connection to real-world myth to be the key to understanding where Middle-earth sits in the overall landscape of human storytelling. Now, I promise I'm not trying to go all Joseph Campbell on you, but I do think it's fair to say that Tolkien believed that there are kind of monomyths in human stories. Tales like that of Atlantis, or structurally similar tales, and stories that involve fathers and sons trapped in unique circumstances, are indeed tales that we see repeated over and over again throughout the cauldron of story. By imbuing Numenor with this legacy, Tolkien has slotted Middle-earth into our real-world storytelling tradition. It's not quite as literally as he did it in The Lost Road, where he proposed that Numenor was literally a part of our real-world history, but it is in a way that allows his fictional story to carry much of the weight and remembrance of historical myth. But, as I think is the case in all of the best stories, there are some deeply personal elements that Tolkien laid out in The Lost Road. In a letter, Tolkien wrote, "I have what some might call an Atlantis complex. Possibly inherited, though my parents died too young for me to know such things about them, and too young to transfer such things by words. Inherited from me, I suppose, by one only of my children, though I did not know that about my son until recently, and he did not know it about me. I mean the terrible recurrent dream, beginning with memory, of the great wave, towering up and coming in ineluctably over the trees and green fields." Throughout his life, Tolkien had been plagued by Atlantis dreams, by dreams of these great waves crashing over the land and causing great tragedy. And little did he know, but his son also had these dreams. It would seem that it had been inherited. Tolkien did not write allegory, but there is certainly an element of him and his family in the characters of Alwin and Oswin. The birth dates of Tolkien and Alwin line up within like a year or two. Tolkien loved languages and philology in much the same way that Alwin did. And while Tolkien wasn't literally tapping into the past, as it is eventually revealed that Alwin and Oswin were, he was, in the sense that he infused all of his works with a very real grounding in myth. From Beowulf to Plato, none of Middle-earth is free of the fingerprints of history. Tolkien made sure of it. It is pretty funny to me that this story started out as Tolkien's attempt to write science fiction, because, at least by modern standards, it's not science fiction at all. But I think that we can see how Tolkien got here by looking at his counterpart, C.S. Lewis. Out of this challenge, Lewis came up with his space trilogy, which consists of the books Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. And especially those first two books, I would say are science fiction, maybe more science fantasy. They take place on separate planets, there's aliens, but the real point of these stories, the real reason these stories are being told, is for the core messaging. Our protagonist, Elwin Ransom, learns to rediscover and reaffirm his faith in each of these stories, each one engaging him with various theological problems. And let's just say that it is not incidental that Tolkien's protagonist, Alwin, has the same name as Elwin Ransom. They're both philologist characters, and both of these stories, both the Space Trilogy and The Lost Road, skirt very heavily around the machine aspect of science fiction, around the technological aspect. Tolkien explicitly has Alwin state that time is not to be conquered by machines, and then comes up with an entirely unmechanized avenue for Alwin to skate through time. Lewis starts off with a real spaceship in the first book, transporting Elwin to Mercury in the first book, but by the second, Elwin is carried off to Venus by God in a magical crystal coffin. Both Tolkien and Lewis decided that what happens in their stories is much more important than how it happens. Both of these stories also end up being an exploration of very Christian ideas. Numenor's tragedy is another Garden of Eden incident, man being gifted a paradise and throwing it away due to sin, forever severing themselves from perfection. In C.S. Lewis's Perelandra, we encounter on Venus a new Eden and a new Eve, an unfallen planet challenged by the powers of evil. Tolkien and Lewis were, in their own unique voices, exploring the concept of man's original sin through the format, loosely, of science fiction. Tolkien wrote of Lewis's space trilogy. The story had, for the more intelligent reader, a great number of philosophical and mythical implications that were enormously enhanced without detracting from the surface adventure. I found the blend of Vera Historia with mythos irresistible. And I think that it is that blend of Vera Historia, true history, with myth that is at the very heart of The Lost Road, and more subtly so, would come to be at the heart of everything that Tolkien wrote. There is an enormous power in language, and I'm sure that many of us, like Alwin, have experienced that feeling of wanting to go back, to walk in time, or at least to look over it. And Tolkien is trying to say that through stories, through history, and through language, we have the chance to do just that. We can find ourselves and echoes of our own lives in the substratum of the past, and we can learn from that. We are not alone. There were 1,000 people that came before us, bearing our same names, facing our same troubles, and thriving for thousands of years before this. It may be so that time is not to be conquered by machines, but perhaps Tolkien is suggesting that it can be explored, revealed, and perhaps even understood with the help of stories. The Lost Road was never completed, although it did get a bit of a revival years later in the Notion Club papers, in which Tolkien wrote about a group of Oxford scholars in the 80s who were having Numenor dreams and realized that the Tale of Numenor was part of their ancient history. And that story is cool, but I don't think it's as good as these little snippets that we have of The Lost Road. I just think that Tolkien was really onto something with this. It's such a different take on the time travel concept, so if you know of any sci-fi, or I guess whatever genre really, that does something similar when it comes to reincarnation and time travel, let me know in the comments, because I am intrigued. It's kind of crazy that I don't see The Lost Road talked about more when it comes to the influence that it had on Tolkien's works, because I read it for the first time for this video, and I was really surprised by that. So if you have read it before, or you haven't, let me know what you thought of it in the comments. Be sure to share this video with someone that you would go time traveling with. I'm trying to think if there's anyone that I would time travel with, but I kind of think that I would just die of dysentery immediately upon going to the past, so maybe it's best that I just stay in this time and place. Be sure to give this video a like if you enjoyed it or you learned something new, and consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talk about The Lord of the Rings, the craft of storytelling, and the other zany stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.